Class on Ruth. Now, if you recall, the two big things that come out of this book as a whole for me is how God's plans for the universe is implemented in the little detail of faithful people's lives every day. People who share his characteristic of loyal love, of hesed, which was a key theme of the book. And the second thing is that, yes, God works in our lives, but sometimes it's not the big, loud, showy things. It's the still, small voice style of just God intervening and directing things in the background. And sometimes, just like Ruth, we may never see how that works out. Ruth never saw the birth of David, but of course, that's the culmination of her story. Now, last class, we journeyed on the bitter road home with Naomi back to Bethlehem, and we saw how Naomi modelled giving that gracious choice to people to stay or to go. We talked about how Ruth continued being there and being for Naomi, even when Naomi was a difficult, bitter old woman who wasn't bringing much, and Ruth was very underappreciated, barely recognised. And finally, the piece that really sort of hit home for me was how God started the process of redemption long before Naomi was ever aware that God was really working in her life. And of course, through it all, we saw Ruth embody that spirit of giving, of loyal love, of continually sacrificing for Naomi as she chose the God of Israel, despite the fact that it appeared the God of Israel was against Naomi and therefore against Ruth. Well, tonight we move into chapter 2, which is based around Bethlehem, because we've left Moab behind. And Bethlehem was it's a small little place. It's kind of irrelevant, but really it's where God advances his purpose in material ways. Firstly, with the birth of David, and later on, of course, with the birth eventually of Jesus. It's a town that saw continual waves of foreign invaders, but still keeps on enduring. The picture here is a clay stamp. It appears that about 2,700 years ago, Josiah, maybe Manasseh, was preparing for the northern invaders, and there's literally gazillions of these things found everywhere in about 5 different towns around Jerusalem, and it looks like Josiah was storing up grain and olive oil and premium red wine, maybe, just putting supplies aside, getting ready for the day when the invaders finally came. But yes, there's a mention there of Bethlehem. It's the first mention of Bethlehem outside of the Bible. So anyway, that's for me interesting, but back to the story. So tonight, we're into chapter 2, second act of the book, and it's a really fantastic storytelling. Can we turn that 300-degree heater down a tiny bit? Maybe just to like slow roast as opposed to immediate cook. Thanks. That's just half of me is going to be well done before I get to midway through the chapter. We're going to see a couple of key things come through this part of the story. First, we're going to see Boaz as the template Israelite, a Torah-informed Jew who demonstrates the spirit of not what do I have to do, but rather what can I do. We're going to see Naomi start to thaw. She's not going to flick the switch and suddenly she's all gung-ho and happy and pleasantness again, but she's going to start to thaw when she gets the inkling that God is working in her life. She gets the first inkling of hope, and she moves from a powerless old woman to someone who is perceiving God's hand and starting to encourage and to bless people in God's name. And Ruth is just going to continue to demonstrate that faithful persistence, just continuing to work day after day after day. And we're reminded somewhat of Romans chapter 2, where Paul talks about those who persevere in good works eventually being rewarded. This is Ruth, and it's an example, a very practical example to us, because it really demonstrates the need for us to just continue in good works, to continue to be patient. Sometimes we might think we see God's hand in our lives, and I think that's a key part of this chapter. God's working, it's all coming together, and then nothing happens. But Ruth just keeps on going, and that's a large part of what our discipleship is about, just to continue in faithful service. Right, well, the chapter starts with a mysterious man introduced into the scene. Look, God is a master storyteller, and in Ruth chapter 2, there's very much those elements of storytelling and building suspense. So we're not given a whole lot, but this mysterious man is introduced, Boaz. The meaning of his name is a bit obscure. If you've got a marginal note that says strong, please insert a question mark after it. That interpretation is based on the Septuagint and some later rabbinic speculation. Truth is, we just don't quite know. And it doesn't matter to the story, and sometimes not knowing and acknowledging that is a healthy thing. Boaz comes into the story, and what we are told about him is that he's a mighty man, in the context meaning a wealthy man, and somehow he's a relative of Elimelech's. The exact relationship, we're not quite sure. He's part of the broader family network. And the narrator is deliberately just trying to put us on the edge of our seats, waiting to see how this is going to unfold. It's a deliberate plot device to keep us interested and to see things through a certain lens, that when Boaz appears, God is going to be acting. That's what's happening. All right, so back to the women in verse 2. Having prepared the listeners with an expectation that something is about to happen, we get insight into Ruth again, demonstrating humility, which is obviously a feature of Ruth's life and personality. She suggests that she goes gleaning, and people who know the grammar way better than I ever will say that it clearly indicates that Ruth is demonstrating that Naomi is her family head and she's asking permission. Another key part in chapter 1, we saw Naomi demonstrating initiative, and again, consistent with the female orientation of this book, we see it's Ruth now who is demonstrating initiative to drive the story forward and to work on behalf of both women in their poverty. Well, in verse 3, wouldn't you know it, Ruth, completely unawares, just so happens to end up in the field of Boaz. Now, a lot of commentators criticise the usual English translations. The Hebrew literally is something like, her chance chanced upon the field of Boaz. There's a deliberate emphasis and repetition in the Hebrew, just pointing out that this is just absolutely no fluke. Ruth didn't make a decision, Ruth didn't have a plan, but God actually did. And, biblical characters saw God's hand in every aspect of everyday life. We will see things as happening because, it's just the natural cycle or rhythm of things. The rain falls because atmospheric pressure, differentials, temperature, blah, clearly I don't know. But the ancients would think that God, sort of made the cloud drop the water, was absolutely involved in every part of everyday life. So when the first readers and hearers heard this story, they would be under no illusion whatsoever. And the narrator is sort of giving a little bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We all know what's going on here. Ruth doesn't know, but we do. This is an act of providence. This is God's hand. And the rest of the story will eventually bear that out. What seemed to be a fluke was a core part of God's plan. It wasn't perceived by Ruth, just like we don't perceive God's hand in our life every time. Sometimes we might suspect it. Sometimes we might be wrong. I'm always cautious about rushing to see it because I'm more worried about being wrong, I think. But Ruth was unawares. What did harvesting look like? Well, thankfully, someone had a very early iPhone and snapped these Egyptians as they were at work. So the way that gleaning worked, it was a team sport. A little bit different to our day. You had a couple of groups, and you can see there's a couple of different workers doing different tasks. Firstly, you've got the guys with the sickles. They're taking off the heads of grain quite close to the top. Very different to our day. Like farmers today prefer dwarf varieties where you don't have a lot of stalks. You don't waste nutrients growing stalks out. Wasn't the case back in ancient time. So they would chop off the ears of grain quite high. Someone would carry them back to a central area where you'd have the bundlers who would tie them up into bundles. Then later they'd cart those away for threshing. All right. Now in Boaz's field, there's a couple of critical differences. This is all men in the Egyptian picture. Clearly Boaz, when you read later like verse 9 and the like, he had some female workers who were doing the bundling part of this, so tying the grain together, and because they were Jewish, they were able to face the camera directly, but we lost the originals. So but very, very similar practices. So I thought this was just a good way of illustrating what's actually happening in the chapter in terms of the different practices and what the women were doing. So the women were on my left, your right side of the picture, tying everything up. That's how it would have worked, in case you were curious. Now, the Mosaic Law Code has some striking similarities with the law codes of different nations around the ancient Near East. But there are some amazing differences, some very striking and significant dissimilarities. And it's those unique aspects, I think, which are probably the most interesting. One of the key differences in the Mosaic Law is that, if you were in Mesopotamia or Egypt and you were wealthy, a completely different group of laws applied to you in terms of what you were liable for, what punishments looked like. But under the Mosaic Law, it was consistent. Whether you were a king or a pauper, you had the same responsibilities and also the same risks at law. You were treated the same. Another critical difference in the Mosaic Law was its provision for the vulnerable. And repeatedly through the law, you'll read about the widows, the orphans, and the refugees or the resident strangers, people like Ruth, who had come from other parts and were now living in the land. And the law of Moses had specific protections and provisions for these groups. In fact, if you cared for them, you would get blessings per Deuteronomy 10, but if you oppressed them under the law, you were told that God would be cursing you. What are some of the unique provisions? Well, gleaning was a unique provision. There is nothing else in surrounding nations, anything like the gleaning provisions that God baked into the economy of Israel. So under the law, farmers had to leave the corners of their field unharvested, and they weren't allowed to double back over the crop. You swept through and picked once, and if you missed something, it was left for the orphans, the widows, and the resident foreigners. And that's found in Leviticus 19, Leviticus 23, and Deuteronomy 24. So 3 times that unique provision is laid out in God's law. At the Feast of Weeks, so you're having your Feast of Weeks, which was essentially a harvest festival, you were obligated to invite the widows, the orphans, and the resident strangers to your table and provide for them through that feast for the entire period of the feast, which ran for a week. And every 3rd year, according to Deuteronomy chapter 14, the tithes, so 10% tax on everything that everybody had, those tithes would be kept locally, distributed to the Levites and the widows, the orphans, and the resident strangers, the refugees who were living amongst Israel. So there's very, very deliberate provision is made for them. And of course also the Sabbath year, Exodus 23, no one could take anything apart from the widows, the orphans, the resident strangers. Right, so poverty relief was built into the economic and the legal structures of Israel. And that was unlike anything else that occurred through the ancient Near East. There are incidents occasionally where a king would sort of chisel a plaque saying, I did a wonderful thing, I helped some poor people, but they were one-off ad hoc type events. It wasn't something that was baked into the national covenant and the national legal code. And for me, that's a great witness to the character of God, and it's something obviously that is sort of integral to the background of Ruth. But I think it's important for us to pause and remember that this is who God is. God cares for the vulnerable, and it's not an ad hoc one-off thing. It was core to how he established the nation of Israel, and it's core to the teachings of Jesus as well. The Old Testament, the law included those provisions, and it was continually reinforced by the prophets, much to the annoyance of the wealthy of their time. But that's who God is. As Isaiah 1 verse 17 commanded the people, learn to do what is right, promote justice, give the oppressed reason to celebrate, take up the cause of the orphan, defend the rights of the widow. That is what God expected of his people. And he identifies himself as the God who steps into the breach, the God who is the father of orphans, who provides for the widows as their advocate. Why? Because God is love, and that love means caring for the vulnerable. And he wants his family to do the same. But it doesn't always work that way. And unfortunately, in Ruth chapter 2, initially, it didn't actually work that way. What are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about verse 6 and 7. So Boaz comes into his field in verse 4 and everything's fantastic. He greets his workers with the name of God. They respond with a blessing. And when I was reading it and thinking about it, you're like, oh wow, this is like idyllic. This is how workplaces are going to work in the kingdom, right? With people just, freely talking about God and recognising his goodness. Brilliant. And then in verse 5, Boaz notices this foreign woman and says, okay, what's happening here? And asks his steward. Now, the unfortunate thing is that verse 7 is the most muddled Hebrew in the entire book. It's really the only part of Ruth where there's some difficulty in understanding exactly what's going on. Verse 6 is fine. So what I'm going to say, I think I'm just going to put a little tentative, I might be wrong, I think this is the most likely. It's sort of consistent with Word Biblical Commentary, Anchor Yale, and particularly the latest NIV application commentary, which is quite recent. It seems to make sense of the Hebrew, but understand I'm not sort of putting this with 100% confidence. I think it is the most likely. Okay. Verse 6, the steward responds to Boaz with what comes across as a little bit of tinge of racism, right? This Moabite woman from Moab, which is kind of repeating the formula in chapter 1, verse 21. But chapter 1, verse 21, when Ruth first turns up in Bethlehem, is emphasising her strangeness, her not belongingness. And the steward is also just not so subtly dwelling on that same sort of fact. And then he goes on in verse 7 and he gives his report of what she said. There is some complexity, as I said. It does cause some concern amongst translators and commentators. So the first thing that he says that she said is that she wanted to glean amongst the cut and bundled heads of grain. So back to our picture, she wanted to get right in there where the women were tying up the grain that had just been harvested by the labourers. As the NET puts it, she asked, "May I follow the harvesters and gather grain among the bundles?" So right in where the work is happening. I noticed that David's translation perhaps stepped that down a little bit, which reflects a common sort of what do we do with this, because it doesn't sound reasonable, okay? But that's what the Hebrew actually says. She asked to gather right among the bundles, right? So right where the women were at work. Now, that was really pushing the plastic of what you could do. It was way in advance of what the law allowed. The law was that gleaning happened in the corners of the fields and after the workers had gone through in Deuteronomy 24. Okay. So commentators struggle with it a little bit, and the question is the Hebrew corrupted, or is the steward misrepresenting Ruth and casting her in a negative light? Right? Is he actually saying, this foreigner, cheeky, she came in and asked for this outrageous privilege. Can you believe it? Not entitled to any of this, taking jobs off her own people, this lot. Probably watch Fox News, this guy. I think he's basically slandering Ruth, accusing her of being an arrogant, pushy foreigner, asking for more than even the local Israelites were entitled. And I think that's consistent with the context. So if you look at what happens, Ruth, when she pitches this to Naomi, she says she wants to gather behind the reapers. That was the way it worked, right? After the reapers have gone through, you go behind them. You don't go right up, in where they're working. That's much less assertive than verse 7. And in verse 9, when Boaz demonstrates, what a generous and good man he is, he says, well, you can work up close to where the women are, and she falls on her face with gratitude. It's not consistent with her having asked for some outrageous, illegal privilege previously. So I think the insight from the NIV application commentary is correct. The assumption that's commonly made that the overseer is presenting an honest report really needs to be questioned. I think far more likely he's actually slandering Ruth and throwing shade at her, which would actually then fit the pattern of the book a little bit further, because you've got the foreman, who's a bit of a mini-pops, to be blunt, and Boaz, who comes across as the good man. And then, of course, when you get into chapter 4, you've got the unnamed relative, Redeemer, who refuses to do the right thing, and again, Boaz, who comes across as the template Israelite who moves to save Ruth. So the wording is rough, the wording is quite disjointed, and we need to be a little cautious of it. And really, the last few words of verse 7 turn into a hot, wet mess. But the first half of it, I think, is clear enough, and the general gist is clear. He's casting shade and aspersions at Ruth, but she continues to faithfully work away, just taking one short break, I think is probably what happens there. So I think you have the contrast between the overseer and Boaz's attitude. So what does Boaz then do? Well, Boaz offers Ruth comprehensive help that covered every possible aspect of what she could need, including things that she perhaps didn't even know that she needed, and certainly way past what she was entitled to think that she might get in terms of help. The first thing he gives her is certainty. He instructs Ruth to stay in his field, kind of 3 times, he tells her. So he really emphasises, stay here, don't go anywhere else, stay right alongside my women. So he's emphasising that her safety, her right to glean is going to be honoured. She knows that she can keep working in his field to the end of harvest. No more random wandering through fields and having to chance her chance upon a certain spot. She's going to be staying here and working. Opportunity. As mentioned on the slide on the harvest process, the female servants were gathering the cut heads, bundling them together, and he gives Ruth this privileged position of being just behind them, so she's going to be first into the area after the work's complete. So obviously, if you're first into the space, you're going to find have the best opportunity to collect what's been missed, dropped, left behind. So he gives her a fabulous opportunity. In verse 9, he gives her protection. So Boaz tells his male servants to leave Ruth alone. And the NET footnotes say that means not to touch her. Now, the Jewish Publication Society Bible Commentary says that while there's a range of nuances to the Hebrew, bluntly, it pretty much means not to touch her in a sexual way. So he instructs his male workers, do not sexually harass this young, vulnerable woman. Right? It's the time of the judges. There are plenty of stories around the period of women who were treated terribly, including being abused and murdered. Boaz steps in and says no, and he makes preemptive arrangements to ensure her safety and her comfort. Now, 10-second diversion here. I've been pretty horrified over the last 10 years to hear stories from not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, numerous different sisters of a whole range of ages, talking about, when they were divorced or when they were single, the level of harassment and unwanted attention that they attracted from within our community. Sometimes it just about breaks you hearing those stories. Other stories of other sisters talking about which men to avoid to be safe from unwanted attention. It's an absolute indictment. It's disgusting. That's period of the judges kind of garbage. Shouldn't happen. And as a community, we're going to face the reality that relying on the occasional Boaz, the exceptional individual who's going to provide preemptive protection to a woman here or a woman there isn't enough. That's not going to prevent systemic issues. And horrifically, you hear too many stories to think it's one-off that these abuses occur. Ruth got lucky. She had Boaz. Boazes aren't everywhere. As a community, I think we need to rethink our governance structures to ensure that women in our field are safe, no matter who they are, no matter where they're from. That was kind of the way Boaz operated, and I think there's something there that we should probably take out. Right, provisions. Boaz does something remarkably generous, radical. He says to Ruth in verse 9, you can have access to the water that's drawn by the male servants. And the Yankee Yale commentary makes it clear the verb is used exclusively of drawing water. Some crackpot suggested it might be wine. No, they were working, not whining. Normally, if you think how society would normally work in ancient Israel, it would be the foreigners who would be drawing water for the Israelites. You could probably tee off and mention Joshua chapter 4, verse 21. The Gibeonites were sort of put into that role for their trickiness, drawing water, cutting wood for the Israelites. But here's Boaz saying, no, this Moabite widow, like she's a woman and she's foreign, she's getting the water that the men of Israel are drawing. And there's an extra little bit of spice here because Boaz is actually inverting history. Under the law, the Moabites were prevented for joining the congregation of Israel for 10 years. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 4 and 5. Now, does anyone want to just flick out a wild guess as to why the Moabites were specifically prohibited from joining the congregation of Israel? Clue, it's got something to do with exactly what Boaz is doing. No, it wasn't actually because of that. It was the reason they were... Dang, you're an impressive individual. I always said so. The Moabites, it says specifically in Deuteronomy 23, verse 4 to 5, they will not enter the congregation for 10 years because they didn't bring you water. Not provisions, water. So here's Boaz with a Moabite widow in his field, taking God's law and just going, absolutely inverting things, right? He's inverting history and is inverting the law by his generosity. And as a consequence of that generosity, David's born, and then Jesus. Isn't that an interesting thing to think about? It's not just providing practical care that Boaz is modelling. He's providing care to a Moabite, a people rejected by God because they wouldn't provide care. He's an incredible individual, Boaz. Incredible individual. There's being generous, and then there's being generous to those people. And that's how he operated. There's something here about how we provide for others, how we demonstrate care, isn't there? Certainty for the long term, not a quick fix and then run away. Providing an opportunity for people to be part of their own rebuilding, their own growth. Providing protection and security, preemptively ensuring they have safety. And then provisions, generously giving them more than they're entitled to, more than their fair share. That's how Boaz operated. He gave them more than they deserved. Quite the man. Boaz demonstrates the spirit of true religion. Someone who is driven by hesed, right, of love, not minimal compliance or even worse, selfishness. The prophets spoke against those sorts of failures. Boaz provides for this poor widow, this member of the despised Moabites. And in our, I referenced Fox News by mistake earlier, sorry. But let's be honest, the economics of migration is complex, is hard. But Christian attitude should first be informed by the repeated themes of the Old and New Testament about providing care for the resident strangers, the people that God cares for. That's what should be driving the thinking. And there are sections of the Christian community, and I guess most famously, but not exclusively, in America, who have some quite wild ideas, totally contrary to that sort of attitude that God displays to the economically disadvantaged. God was never a free market economist. Never was. And because he doesn't change, it's not going out on a limb to say he never will be. The law of Moses was very explicit about providing help for the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the refugees. Humans, all of us, and we don't want to pick on one particular segment, we need to look inwards at ourselves. We're all incredibly good at justifying our hardness and minimising our obligations. Like the lawyer said, who is my neighbour, right? We're all good at that. In Boaz, we see a template Israelite who, instead of saying, well, what do I have to do, instead was looking at, what can I do? And that's the spirit of God's law, the spirit of God's love embodied. There's no how much is enough. And, what's the application to us today? Pretty obvious. We have some incredible opportunities to help, easy opportunities to help, really. There's, Agape in Action, I don't know how to say it, TAFI, the clinic on Tanner Island. Is that right, Judy? Taffy, okay. And then there's the appallingly named Christadelphian Refugee Association Committee, CRAC. Terrible acronym. Meal a day. There's boundless opportunities for us to actually make a difference and help, whether it's our time or our money. When we've got a Boaz type of attitude, God can do incredible things. That's pretty evident in the story. It's Boaz's attitude that's a fundamental part of what God harnesses to advance his kingdom agenda. Don't think it's any different with us. All right? God will use us if we have that Boaz kind of mindset. And in in chapter 2, verse 10, Ruth falls to the ground in gratitude to Boaz. She recognises his graciousness and responds. And she demonstrates through the whole chapter this sort of humility, which is why I'm pretty certain, that the foreman was totally misrepresenting her. She doesn't assume her rights. Despite the fact it's very clear what the law said, she still asks and asks and asks permission. And it's the spirit that we should show. Even when we have rights, we don't insist upon them. There's a number of examples of Paul in the New Testament, in Philemon. He says, well, I could insist that you took back this fellow, but I'm appealing to you to actually do it for the right reasons rather than exercising authority. And similarly in 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 6 to 8, he says, look, as a nursing mother, we were there supporting and encouraging and nurturing, not exercising authority. And it's a model for all of us, whether we have authority or not. How we ask and how we engage with each other. We don't bang the table because we're right. We've got God's word behind us, or so we think. It's a model of loving faithfulness that Ruth exhibited. She was grateful for something that was her legal right? Because that's the sort of attitude and mindset that God will work with. And Boaz's next action, slightly later in the day, would have shocked the living daylights out of everybody, including Ruth. Right, including Ruth. She's invited to the table to sit down and eat in a highly patriarchal society, like having the local leader even acknowledge the presence of a woman would be unlikely, but to acknowledge a widow and a Moabite and invite them to the table and then interact with them like this. People would have been talking about this when they went home that night, not in a good way. Like, this would have been shocking behaviour. Shocking behaviour. And I couldn't think of any examples of such radical inclusion and table fellowship from this event until the Gospels. I don't know if anyone can think of any other instances of this sort of radical barrier crossing table fellowship. Jesus obviously demonstrated it consistently, he was criticised for it all the time, with all parts of society. But interesting that here's Boaz, demonstrating that same radical spirit of inclusion, just going straight across all of the expectations that people had. Now, it says in Ruth chapter 2, verse 13, 14, that he was handing her some parched grain. You might wonder what that is. I did, and I sort of tried to find out what it was. If you go to the health food aisle of your local supermarket, you can probably find something called freekeh or something similar, and basically it's like green wheat kernels. It's picked a bit early, rubbed, and you sort of soak it, and I was going to bring along some tonight for you to try, but it is so bland. For a Western, it looks a bit like pearl barley. So if you imagine pearl barley, you're pretty much good to go. Pearl barley's actually even nicer, so low bar. Anyway, that's just by the by. And the narrator wants us to notice again Ruth's diligence and her carefulness as she saves some of the surplus food for later, which she will share with Naomi. And that's the kind of, the Proverbs 6 kind of wisdom, prudence, forethought. Like all through, Ruth is just displaying these great characteristics. Okay, just conscious a fraction of time. All right, so verse 15 and 16, Boaz goes from generous to just straight out ridiculous. But he does it in an interesting way. He tells the male workers to let Ruth, get too close to where the gleaning action is. He says, look, don't hold her back. If she oversteps the line a little bit, let it go. And he tells his women to deliberately drop handfuls of grain. So he's putting his finger on the scale and tilting them in Ruth's favour. Absolutely. Okay. But Ruth doesn't know that. She's got to keep working. She doesn't know that Boaz has done anything for her. God's generosity in bringing Ruth here is hidden. And now Boaz's generosity to Ruth is being hidden a little bit as well. It brought to mind for me Matthew chapter 6, verse 2 to 4, that model of charity where you don't go sounding off the trumpet every time you're about to do something. Boaz just has a quiet little word to his workers, just do this. Doesn't make a fuss about it. Ruth had no idea. He's doing his good deeds, but he's keeping them in the background, providing material, meaningful help, but in a way where the recipient, Ruth, doesn't actually necessarily know the full extent of loving kindness which has been demonstrated. Again, something for us to think about. So Ruth gathered, the record says, an ephah of the barley grain after she threshed it out. Now, how much is that? Well, I'm glad you asked. So according to Exodus chapter 16, verse 22 and 26, an ephah of manna would last you about 10 days. That was about 10 days of food. However, the volume of an ephah appears to have moved over time. By the 8th century, it's about 22 litres. Earlier on, it appears like it was around 10 to 12. And I'm not quite sure how nutritious manna was relative to barley. If I had to pick between the two, I'd say manna was more likely slightly better nutritional value. The picture you've got there anyway is Ruth carrying around about 20 litres of barley, which is about 12 kilo of grain. So it's it's an enormous amount of grain to harvest in one day. Again, the archaeologists have pulled stuff out for us, and by the Mesopotamian wage scale, she's got about 15 days worth of pay that she's gathered in one day. Right, so it's a huge amount that she's achieved in one day. And if she continued to gather at that rate through the remaining, it's basically 2 months, 1 month of barley harvest, 1 month of wheat harvest, depending exactly on the ephah measure, she would have ended up with 8 to 12 months worth of food for the two women, right? And the point of the record is, look how much stuff she's got. Like, it's emphasising that she's just been spectacularly successful by her hard work and Boaz's hidden generosity as well. So 8 to 12 months worth of food through the accumulation of the period. Now, she gets that back to Naomi. Hey? Look, it was probably an Uber. Yeah, he was advanced. Thanks, John. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 20, Naomi has renamed herself Mara. She's changed her name from pleasantness to bitterness. She's never actually called that, and she declares that God has cursed her. And then at the start of the chapter, I sit there and I read, Ruth says, I'm going to go gleaning, if that's okay. Why doesn't Naomi say, great idea, I'll come with you? She's walked somehow back from Moab to Bethlehem, but now she's just in the house not leaving. I don't know what's going on. She, suddenly very old and frail, depressed about losing everyone in her life. It's possible. Don't know. But for some reason, she's quite passive, strangely passive. But in verse 18, when Naomi sees the amount of grain that Ruth has gathered, she immediately knows something's happened. And in verse 19, she just runs straight over the top of Ruth. She asks her, where'd you go? What happened? Who was this? Oh, blessings be on his name. And Ruth can't get a word in edgeways because Naomi is suddenly coming to life when she sees what has happened. And when Ruth explains in verse 19 what had happened, how she had got to Boaz's field and his kindness to her, Naomi goes even further. She blesses Boaz in the name of God. Now, some translations explicitly suggest that Naomi also blessed God, and other translations leave it a little ambiguous as to whether she's blessing Boaz and God or just Boaz. The Hebrew is she just blessed Boaz. That's what happened. She doesn't bless God here. But she is blessing Boaz in God's name. God is incredibly patient with his children, isn't he? Right? Naomi is dead set that God is against her. He's cursed her. She's got nothing left. She's become this passive person who's in the house, not even going out to try and advance her own cause and gather food. God has acted in her life, gave her Ruth, brought harvest to Bethlehem. Now he's led Ruth out to the field of Boaz, but Naomi's not yet ready to praise God. Naomi's, she's a little bit in front of where she was, but she's not there yet. In 2 Peter, Peter's emphasising that God has a timeline. But Peter writes in 2 Peter 3 verse 9, the Lord is not slow concerning his promise, as some regard slowness, but is being patient toward you. God is waiting for you. He's got his timeline, he's got his plan, but he's waiting for you. Because he doesn't wish for any to perish, but all to come to repentance. God waits for people. We see that in the way that Jesus interacted with his disciples. Occasionally, Jesus gets a little bit frustrated, you saw the miracle yesterday, why are you asking me the same question today? But day by day by day, he continued to work with those disciples to show them God's love. We're no different. Jesus is no different. God is still patient with us. And I think in this piece with Naomi, we see a bit of God's patience, but we see her starting to thaw as she perceives God's hand, maybe is in this thing with Ruth coming into Boaz's field. Maybe God still does have some use for me, some interest in my life, seeing the blessing that has accrued from Ruth's hard work. We're asked to demonstrate a gentle patience to each other as well, just as God does to us. In Galatians chapter 6, Paul says, brothers and sisters, if a person is discovered in some sin, you who are spiritual restore such a person in a spirit of gentleness. Pay close attention to yourselves so you are not tempted. Carry one another's burdens. In this way, you fulfill the law of Christ. A spirit of gentleness, of carrying each other's burdens. That's what we are called to demonstrate. And it's easy to skip over that quickly. Burdens aren't easy to carry. They're heavy. That word, burden there, it's used of the labourers in the vineyard, the ones who bore the heat and burden of the day. Burdens are heavy, they're sharp, they're hard, they're tiring. They're probably unreasonable and unfair. And Paul says, to help the Naomi in your life, I want you to carry the 12 kilo of grain. I want you to carry the burden of their bitterness. I want you to carry the burden of their unreasonable expectations, them not doing anything to help themselves. That's what the Spirit of Christ is requiring of you. Because God is patient with us, whether we deserve it or not. And he expects us to be patient with others, whether they deserve it or not, and to carry that burden for them, as unreasonable as it is. That's the spirit of Hesed, that's loving kindness. And the reality is that that loving kindness, that faithfulness, that changes people. And Naomi was being changed by Ruth's loving kindness, by Ruth's diligent and goodness and faithfulness to her. It takes time. Ruth and God in chapter 2 are demonstrating that Hesed, that tremendous patience with Naomi to carry the burden. Conversion, healing, call it what you will, is not always a on-the-spot, snap, road to Damascus kind of experience. Continual Hesed, loving kindness. That's what transforms people. That's what restores people. And that's what it's going to do for Naomi through the course of this story. How long? How far? Don't know. All the way. Not only all the way, it's the only way. It's the only way. And eventually it transfers Naomi, who's flipped Tamara, back to Naomi again. But it takes time. This is a picture which we were lucky enough to take in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. Sarah wondered why. She's still wondering why. It's a very early calendar that just demonstrates the agricultural calendar of Israel. And you can see it talks 1 month for reaping barley, 1 month for reaping and measuring the grain, which is probably the wheat. So there's 2 months where they are gathering the grain. Basically, Ruth is going to work April through to May gathering food. So there you go, Sarah. It was worth taking the photo. Well, anticipation is a great thing. And when you go to the orchestra, you sit there and they're making the most awful screechy noises as they start tuning up the instruments. And you're thinking, my goodness, I hope I didn't pay too much for this. Sounds terrible. But it's all part of building the anticipation. Because once they finish tuning up, once they've got ready, then there's going to be the big moment when the great music starts and everything's going to happen. The picture here is the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. But the audience, having listened to all the tune-up, getting ready to be entertained, the first thing they're treated to is John Cage's 1952 composition called 4 minutes 33 in 3 movements. Does anyone know what it sounds like? Absolute silence. The only thing you hear is ambient noise. They sit there, literally dead still, in 3 movements. The gall of the man. Quite controversial at the time. Ruth chapter 2, verse 23 is the narrator's John Cage moment. Right? You've got Boaz's introduction. Things are happening. The violins are screeching away. You've got the lucky location. You've got the generous gleaning privileges. You get the lunchtime interaction. You get the hidden favours, incredible amount of grain. And then nothing. But it doesn't go for 4 minutes 33. It goes for 2 months. It goes for 2 months. And Ruth kept working. The day after she met Boaz, she went back to the field and she probably was just about skipping. Don't know that she was skipping the next day, but she probably walked quickly. And then on day 30 and 31 and 35 and 40, nothing happened. 48 days, adjusting for Sabbaths, of back-breaking work. Each day, hope fading. What started with so much clear evidence of God's hand in her life was turning into a bleak, long future of subsistence living begging, back-breaking labour, and widowhood. At best, you'll get through a year and then do it again. Future suddenly wasn't looking good. Galatians says, don't give up, don't get tired, keep going, because the reward is going to come. Scripture has a lot to say on a similar vein about patience, about waiting for God. Here's a sample of two. Be still before God and wait patiently before him, Psalm 37 verse 7. It's good to wait patiently for deliverance from the Lord, Lamentations 3 verse 26. And they're really easy to say and really hard to do, especially if you're staring down the barrel of living right on the edge of poverty or starvation, like Ruth and Naomi. Even harder when you thought God was moving in your life, so much clear evidence of it. It's like, you got baptised because God was obviously doing stuff in the nations. Prophecy was being fulfilled faster than anything you could imagine. And in your own life, look at these circumstances that led me to get baptised, that built my faith, and it's all going to happen. Jesus is going to come any moment now. And that was 19-something. Don't know when I got baptised. 92, which is nothing compared to many of you, I know. But everything was there. It was all so obvious. And we just have to keep going back to the field. Days turn into weeks, to months, to years, to decades. Was God there? Well, yeah, he was. Did God lead Ruth to Boaz's field? Yeah, he did. Were we right to expect more from the godly man? Maybe. Sometimes providence isn't quite as obvious as we'd like, or as think. Or we think it's clear that this is what's going to happen next, and it doesn't. We often are waiting for a solution to our problems today, but really they're symptoms of the bigger problem. What we're really waiting for is the return of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 1 verse 7. We know that's the ultimate solution, that we know that's what providence is actually building to. But when we're facing day after day of disappointment like Ruth, that can be hard. But we have to keep going. And Ruth had to go back to the field and keep working day after day. Eventually her hopes faded, and probably that first day became just a distant memory. All we can do is demonstrate hesed, a love that changes the future, loving kindness. We can't always see what God is doing. We can't always see, even if we would like to imagine, we can't see God's timeline. Sometimes he works quickly, often not so much. But we're called to faithfulness. We're not called to outcomes. We're called to faithfulness, to continue to endure. And in the New Testament, we see that same call echoed. Paul writes in Romans 12, verse 6 to 8, that we all have different gifts, and we have to use them according to the grace given to us. We have to love each other deeply, not grow weary in doing good, but use the gifts we have. That's the spirit of hesed. And for each of us, that's different. For Boaz, hesed meant showing compassion, showing generous protection. For Ruth, it meant going back to the field day after day, even though she wasn't seeing anything happen despite her hopes. And for Naomi, it meant finding the courage to actually hope again, of allowing herself to be transformed by the hesed, the loving kindness of others. Their loving kindness, their hesed, looked different, as it will amongst us, because of our age, our experience, our whatever it is. We all have different gifts, we're in different spaces. But hesed quietly changes lives. Loving faithfulness in partnership with God transforms lives. And in the story of Ruth, despite the fact that chapter 2 ends with a whimper, with a fade to black, the reality is it's still part of the story of transforming history through continuing to show that steadfast love. Their simple acts, their turning back to the field, Ruth going back to the field every day, is what was still propelling God's plan forward to David. Ruth didn't see that anymore, but it's true. The kingdom of God doesn't always come with noise and power. Sometimes it's a still small voice. Sometimes it moves forward when a lowly widow is just walking to the field every day, gathering food on behalf of her mother-in-law. And I think in our lives we're called to do the same thing. Just continue to keep going, keep enduring, because eventually, God will bring that future that we've seen signs of and we keep hoping for. Thanks.